quiet suburban neighborhood, an unexpected adventure unfolds when Greg, a tech enthusiast, discovers his young niece and nephew sneaking out to an old shed at night. What begins as simple curiosity evolves into a heartwarming journey of rediscovery, environmental awareness, and community spirit. As Greg unravels the mystery behind the children's nightly excursions, he finds himself drawn into a world where technology and nature intertwine, leading to a series of events that will change not only his life, but the entire community's future. This tale of family bonds, environmental stewardship, and unexpected twists will leave you questioning the true meaning of progress and the power of small actions to create big changes. If you love your family and want to listen to amazing and shocking stories, click on subscribe and avoid 20 years of bad luck in your life. Greg stood at his kitchen window, a mug of coffee cooling in his hand, as he watched the sun dip below the horizon. His brow furrowed as he caught sight of two small figures darting across the backyard. It was Mia and Jake, his sister's kids, who were staying with him for the summer. They were heading towards the old shed at the far end of the property, giggling and shushing each other as they went. This wasn't the first time he'd noticed their nighttime excursions. For the past week, like clockwork, they'd sneak out after dinner, thinking no one was watching. Greg felt a twinge of concern. What could two kids, aged 8 and 10, be up to in that dusty old shed? As he watched them disappear inside, memories of his own childhood adventures came flooding back. Summers spent building forts, concocting potions from backyard plants, and staying up late to catch fireflies. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, but it quickly faded as adult worries crept in. What if they were getting into something dangerous? Greg set down his mug and headed to the hall closet. He rummaged around until he found an old flashlight, testing the batteries before slipping it into his pocket. He debated for a moment whether to confront the kids directly or investigate on his own first. Curiosity won out, and he decided to do a little reconnaissance. Stepping out onto the back porch, Greg took a deep breath of the warm summer air. Crickets chirped in the grass, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak tree. He made his way across the lawn, careful to avoid the creaky board on the path that always gave him away. As he approached the shed, Greg could hear muffled voices and occasional bursts of laughter. Whatever they were up to, it didn't sound sinister. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that they might be getting into mischief. He'd promised his sister he'd keep them safe and out of trouble. Greg crept closer, his heart racing a bit despite himself. He felt a little silly, sneaking around his own backyard, but he wanted to catch them in the act if they were up to no good. The shed's old wooden walls were weathered and gray, with ivy creeping up one side. A faint light glowed through the cracks between the boards. He reached for the door handle, then paused. Should he knock first? Burst in? What if they were just playing an innocent game and he ruined it with his paranoia? Greg took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever he might find inside. Just as he was about to turn the handle, a loud crash from inside the shed made him jump. It was followed by a yelp and then hushed, urgent whispers. Greg's protective instincts kicked in, overriding his hesitation. He grasped the handle firmly and pushed the door open, flooding the interior with moonlight. "All right, you two," he called out, trying to keep his voice stern but not angry. "What's going on in here?" The beam of his flashlight swept across the shed's cluttered interior, illuminating dusty shelves and cobwebbed corners. And there, in the middle of it all, stood Mia and Jake, their eyes wide with surprise and a touch of guilt. But it wasn't the kids that made Greg's jaw drop. It was what surrounded them that left him speechless. Greg blinked, his flashlight beam revealing a scene he hadn't expected. The dusty interior of the shed had been transformed into a colorful workshop. Paint cans, brushes, and wood scraps were scattered across an old workbench. In the center, Mia and Jake stood frozen, their hands covered in bright splatters of paint. But what caught Greg's attention was the half-finished structure between them, a birdhouse. It was crudely built, but lovingly decorated, with vibrant colors and whimsical designs adorning its wooden walls. "Uncle Greg," Mia exclaimed, breaking the silence. "We can explain." Jake nodded vigorously, his freckled face a mixture of worry and excitement. "We didn't mean to make a mess, honest." Greg lowered his flashlight, his stern expression softening into one of curiosity. "What's all this about, kids?" he asked, stepping further into the shed. Mia, always the more talkative of the two, launched into an explanation. "We found a bird's nest in the oak tree last week," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "But it fell down in that big storm, and we were worried about the baby birds." Jake chimed in, his voice quieter but no less earnest. "We wanted to build them a new home, but we didn't want to bother you. You're always so busy with your computer stuff." Greg felt a pang of guilt at Jake's words. Had he really been that disconnected? He looked around the shed with new eyes, taking in the children's project. Despite the mess, he couldn't help but feel impressed by their initiative and creativity. "So you've been sneaking out here every night to build this?" Greg asked, gesturing to the birdhouse. The children nodded, their expressions a mix of pride and apprehension. "We used the old wood we found in here," Mia explained, "and we bought the paint with our allowance." Greg picked up the birdhouse, examining it closely. The construction was wobbly, and the paint job was far from perfect, but there was an undeniable charm to it. He could see the care and effort they had put into every brushstroke. "You know," Greg said slowly, a smile spreading across his face, "when I was your age, I used to build birdhouses with my dad. But I think yours might be even better than the ones we made." The children's faces lit up at his words, their fear of punishment evaporating. "Really?" Jake asked, his eyes wide. Greg nodded, setting the birdhouse back down. "Really? But next time, how about you let me know what you're up to? I might even be able to help." Mia and Jake exchanged excited glances. "You mean we can keep working on it?" Mia asked. "Of course," Greg replied. "In fact, why don't we make this a project we can all work on together?" The kids cheered, their enthusiasm infectious. Greg found himself caught up in their excitement, memories of his own childhood summers flooding back. All right," he laughed. "It's getting late now, but tomorrow after dinner, we'll come out here and I'll show you some tricks my dad taught me. Deal?" "Deal," the children chorused. As they cleaned up and headed back to the house, Greg felt a warmth in his chest he hadn't experienced in years. He'd been so caught up in his tech world that he'd forgotten the simple joys of creating something with his hands, of connecting with nature. Looking at Mia and Jake's eager faces, he realized this birdhouse project might be about more than just helping some baby birds. It could be a chance to bond with his niece and nephew, to share something meaningful with them. As they reached the back door, Greg paused, looking back at the old shed. In the moonlight, it no longer seemed like a forgotten relic, but a place of potential and new beginnings. He had a feeling their summer was about to take an unexpected but wonderful turn. As the days passed, the old shed became a hub of activity. Greg, Mia, and Jake fell into a comfortable routine, spending their evenings working on the birdhouse project. What started as a simple idea had blossomed into something much more significant. Greg found himself eagerly anticipating their nightly sessions. He'd leave his laptop closed, ignoring the constant ping of emails, and instead focus on teaching the kids about different bird species and their habitats. To his surprise, he discovered he knew more than he realized, memories of childhood birdwatching trips with his father resurfacing with each lesson. "Did you know that the northern cardinal doesn't migrate?" Greg explained one evening as they worked on perfecting the roof of their birdhouse. "They stay here all year round." Mia's eyes widened with interest. "Is that why we see them in the winter too?" Greg nodded, pleased by her observation. Exactly. And the males are the bright red ones. They use their color to attract mates and defend their territory. Jake, who had been quietly sanding a piece of wood, looked up. Like how I wear my lucky red shirt for baseball games. Greg chuckled, ruffling Jake's hair. Sort of, buddy. Nature has its own way of showing off. As they worked, Greg found himself sharing more than just facts about birds. He told stories about his own childhood, about the times he'd spent in nature before technology became the center of his world. The kids listened with rapt attention, asking questions and sharing their own observations about the world around them. One evening, as they were putting the finishing touches on the birdhouse, Mia asked a question that caught Greg off guard. "Uncle Greg, why don't you ever go outside much? You're always on your computer." Greg paused, paintbrush hovering over the birdhouse. He realized Mia was right. When had he become so disconnected from the natural world? "You know, Mia," he said slowly, "sometimes grown-ups forget what's important. We get so caught up in our work and our gadgets that we forget to look at the world around us." Jake nodded sagely. "Like when Mom takes our tablets away and tells us to go play outside." Greg laughed. "Exactly like that. And you know what? Your mom is right. There's so much to see and learn out here." As if to prove his point, a robin landed on a nearby branch, its red breast bright against the green leaves. The children watched in awe as it tilted its head, listening for worms in the soil. Inspired by this moment, Greg had an idea. "How about we do more than just build this birdhouse? Why don't we organize an event to teach our neighbors about the birds in our area?" Mia and Jake's eyes lit up with excitement. "We could make it a big party," Mia exclaimed. "And show everyone our birdhouse," Jake added. Greg nodded, feeling a surge of enthusiasm he hadn't experienced in years. "We could invite the whole neighborhood, set up information stations, maybe even do some bird watching." As they brainstormed ideas for their community event, Greg felt a shift within himself. The constant urge to check his phone or return to his computer had faded. Instead, he found himself fully present, engaged in the moment with Mia and Jake. That night, as they wrapped up their work session, Greg looked at the birdhouse with a sense of pride. It wasn't just a home for birds anymore. It had become a symbol of connection to nature, to his family, and to a part of himself he had nearly forgotten. As they walked back to the house, fireflies blinking in the summer twilight, Greg made a silent promise to himself. He would find a better balance between his tech-focused work and the natural world. He owed it to himself, to Mia and Jake, and to the sense of wonder they had reawakened in him. The upcoming community event would be just the beginning. Greg had a feeling that this summer would bring changes he never expected, all sparked by a simple birdhouse and two curious kids. The day of the community event arrived, bringing with it a buzz of excitement that seemed to electrify the entire neighborhood. Greg, Mia, and Jake had spent weeks preparing, transforming the once-forgotten backyard into a vibrant celebration of local biodiversity. As the first guests began to arrive, Greg felt a mix of nervousness and pride. This was so different from the tech conferences he was used to, but somehow it felt more significant. "Uncle Greg, look." Mia tugged at his sleeve, pointing to a group of their neighbors setting up a table. "Mrs. Johnson is bringing her famous lemonade," Jake chimed in. "And Mr. Rivera said he'd bring his telescope for birdwatching." Greg smiled, amazed at how the entire community had rallied around their idea. What had started as a simple birdhouse project had grown into something much larger. Throughout the day, the backyard buzzed with activity. Children ran from station to station, their faces painted with colorful bird designs. Adults gathered around information booths, learning about local bird species and how to create bird-friendly gardens. Greg found himself at the center of it all, moving from group to group, sharing his newfound knowledge with an enthusiasm that surprised even him. He explained the importance of native plants, demonstrated how to use binoculars properly, and even led a workshop on building simple birdhouses. "You know, Greg," his next-door neighbor said, clapping him on the shoulder, "I never pegged you for a nature enthusiast. It's great to see this side of you." Greg laughed, realizing how much he had changed in just a few weeks. "Neither did I, to be honest, but Mia and Jake opened my eyes to what I was missing." As the afternoon wore on, Greg noticed something remarkable happening. People who had lived next to each other for years without really talking were now engaged in animated conversations. Children who usually spent their time indoors were running around, faces flushed with excitement as they learned about the natural world around them. The old shed, once a forgotten corner of the property, had become the heart of the event. Greg, Mia, and Jake had set up a display showcasing their birdhouse building journey, complete with before and after photos and the kids' hand-drawn designs. "And here," Greg explained to a group gathered around the shed, "is where it all began. This old place that I thought was just taking up space turned out to be a gateway to something amazing." As he spoke, a flash of red caught his eye. A cardinal had landed on the roof of their birdhouse, which they had mounted on a pole near the shed. The crowd fell silent, watching in awe as the bird tilted its head, examining its potential new home. Mia squeezed Greg's hand, her eyes shining. "Look, Uncle Greg, it likes our house." Jake, usually the quieter of the two, spoke up. "Does this mean we did a good job?" Greg felt a lump form in his throat. "We did an excellent job, buddy. All of us." As the event wound down and the last of the neighbors headed home, Greg, Mia, and Jake sat on the back porch, tired but content. The yard was quieter now, but evidence of the day's excitement remained. Colorful posters, empty lemonade pitchers, and a new sense of community that seemed to linger in the air. "You know," Greg said, looking at Mia and Jake, "I think we did more than just teach people about birds today. We brought people together." Mia nodded thoughtfully. "It was like the whole neighborhood became a big family." Jake yawned, leaning against Greg's arm. "Can we do this again next year?" Greg chuckled, putting his arm around Jake. "I think we might have started a new tradition." As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the backyard, Greg felt a profound sense of gratitude. What had begun as a simple summer project had transformed not just the old shed, but the entire community. And more importantly, it had changed him. Looking out at the yard, now filled with birdhouses and newly planted native flowers, Greg realized that this was just the beginning. The old shed wasn't just a workshop anymore. It had become a symbol of connection, growth, and the unexpected joy of rediscovery. As the weeks passed, the birdhouse became more than just a wooden structure in the backyard. It transformed into a symbol of hope and renewal, not just for the birds, but for Greg himself. Each morning, he found himself drawn to the window, watching with childlike anticipation as various birds visited their creation. One particularly memorable evening, Greg called out to Mia and Jake, his voice filled with excitement. "Kids, come quick! I think it's happening!" The children raced to join him on the porch, their eyes wide with wonder as they watched a pair of chickadees flitting in and out of the birdhouse. It was clear that the birds had decided to make it their home. "They're moving in," Mia whispered, her voice filled with awe. Jake tugged on Greg's sleeve. "Does this mean there will be baby birds soon?" Greg nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "It might, buddy. We'll have to watch and see." As they observed the busy chickadees, Greg felt a profound shift in his perspective. The world he had once viewed primarily through screens now seemed vibrant and alive in ways he had forgotten. The intricate dance of the birds, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, even the dampness of the grass under his feet, all of it felt new and significant. Over the next few days, Greg found himself spending more time outdoors. He'd wake up early, brew a cup of coffee, and sit on the porch, watching the world come alive. The chickadees became a constant presence, their cheerful calls a soundtrack to his mornings. One evening, as the sun was setting, Greg noticed an unusual level of activity around the birdhouse. He called Mia and Jake, and together they watched in hushed excitement as tiny, featherless heads peeked out from the entrance. "The eggs hatched!" Jake exclaimed, his voice a mix of excitement and disbelief. Mia squeezed Greg's hand. "We did it, Uncle Greg. We really helped them." Greg felt a wave of emotion wash over him. "We sure did, kiddo. We sure did." As they watched the parent birds tirelessly flying back and forth, bringing food to their chirping babies, Greg reflected on his own journey. Just like these tiny birds, he too had undergone a transformation. The tech-obsessed workaholic was giving way to someone more balanced, more connected to the world around him. The night the baby birds were ready for their first flight, Greg couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, filled with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. As the first light of dawn broke, he was already on the porch, Mia and Jake sleepily joining him. They watched in breathless silence as one by one, the fledglings took their first tentative hops to the edge of the birdhouse. The parent birds chirped encouragingly, flitting nearby branches, coaxing their babies to take the leap. When the first baby bird spread its wings and took flight, wobbly but determined, Greg felt his heart soar with it. Tears pricked at his eyes, and he pulled Mia and Jake close. "Look at that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Isn't it beautiful?" As the rest of the fledglings followed suit, each taking their first flight into the world, Greg felt as if he too was seeing everything with new eyes. The simple act of helping these birds had awakened something in him, a connection to nature, to family, to the joy of nurturing and growth. Later that day, as they sat in the backyard, watching the young birds explore their new world, Mia looked up at Greg. "Uncle Greg, you're different now," she said thoughtfully. Greg raised an eyebrow. "Oh? How so?" Jake nodded in agreement with his sister. "You smile more, and you're not always on your phone." Greg chuckled, but there was a note of realization in his laugh. The kids were right. He had changed, and for the better. This journey, which had started with a mysterious trip to the old shed, had led him to rediscover a part of himself he thought he'd lost. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Greg made a silent promise to himself. He would hold on to this newfound appreciation for the world around him. The birdhouse, and the life it had nurtured, would serve as a constant reminder of the beauty and wonder that existed just outside his door, if only he took the time to look. Inspired by his transformative experience, Greg found himself brimming with new ideas. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to be done, more ways to connect his love for technology with his rediscovered passion for nature. One morning, as he sat on the porch watching the birds flit about the yard, an idea struck him. He called out to Mia and Jake, who were playing nearby. "Hey kids, what would you think about sharing what we've learned with more people?" Mia's eyes lit up. "Like another party?" Greg chuckled. "Sort of, but bigger. I was thinking we could start a series of workshops. We could teach people about local wildlife, how to build birdhouses, and ways to make their yards more animal-friendly." Jake, usually the quieter of the two, spoke up. "Could we use your computers to help, Uncle Greg?" Greg paused, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You know what, Jake? That's a brilliant idea. We could combine nature education with technology." Over the next few days, Greg threw himself into planning. He reached out to local conservation groups, set up a schedule for workshops, and began to develop ideas for how to integrate technology into their nature education efforts. The first workshop was a resounding success. Families from all over the neighborhood gathered in Greg's backyard, eager to learn. Greg found himself in his element, moving seamlessly between explaining the basics of birdwatching and demonstrating how to use apps for bird identification. "See?" he explained to an attentive group, holding up his tablet. "This app uses artificial intelligence to identify bird species based on photos or sound recordings. It's like having an expert ornithologist in your pocket." The workshops quickly gained popularity, with more people signing up each week. Greg was amazed at how easily he could blend his tech expertise with his new passion for nature. He taught coding basics to kids, showing them how to create simple programs that could track bird sightings or predict migration patterns. One evening, after a particularly successful workshop, Mia approached Greg with a thoughtful expression. "Uncle Greg, what if we made our own app? One that could help people learn about the birds in their own backyards." Greg felt a surge of excitement at the idea. "Mia, that's fantastic. We could create something that combines everything we've learned." Over the next few weeks, Greg devoted his free time to developing the app. He involved Mia and Jake in every step of the process, from brainstorming features to testing early versions. The kids' enthusiasm was infectious, and Greg found himself more invigorated by this project than he had been by any of his recent tech ventures. The app, which they named Backyard Birds, was designed to be user-friendly and educational. It included features like a bird identification tool, a log for tracking sightings, and even a community forum where users could share photos and tips. As they prepared to launch the app, Greg couldn't help but reflect on how far they'd come. What had started as a simple birdhouse project had evolved into something that could potentially impact thousands of people, inspiring them to connect with nature in their own communities. The day of the app launch arrived, coinciding with their largest workshop yet. As Greg stood before the gathered crowd, Mia and Jake by his side, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. "Welcome, everyone," he began, his voice strong and clear. "Today, we're not just launching an app, we're launching a movement. A movement to reconnect with the nature that surrounds us, to foster a sense of wonder in our own backyards, and to use technology as a tool for conservation rather than distraction." As he demonstrated the app's features, Greg could see the excitement building in the audience. People were already downloading it, eager to start their own backyard explorations. One participant raised her hand. "This is amazing, Greg. How did you come up with all this?" Greg smiled, looking down at Mia and Jake. "It all started with two curious kids in an old shed. They reminded me of what's truly important, connecting with nature, with our communities, and with each other." As the workshop concluded and people began to disperse, chatting excitedly about their plans to use the app, Greg felt a profound sense of fulfillment. He had found a way to bridge his two worlds, technology and nature, in a way that could make a real difference. That evening, as they sat in the backyard watching the sunset, Jake looked up at Greg. "Uncle Greg, are we going to keep doing this even after summer ends?" Greg nodded, his heart full. "Absolutely, buddy. I think this is just the beginning of our adventure." As if to punctuate his words, a chickadee landed on the birdhouse they had built together, its cheerful call a reminder of where their journey had begun. Greg realized that in helping others connect with nature, he had found his own path forward, one that combined his skills, his passions, and his newfound appreciation for the world around him. As summer began to wane, Greg, Mia, and Jake settled into a comfortable routine of workshops, app updates, and backyard birdwatching. The old shed had been fully transformed into a nature education center, complete with microscopes, field guides, and a small computer lab for app demonstrations. One crisp morning, as Greg was preparing for the day's workshop, he noticed an unfamiliar car pull up in front of the house. A man in a sharp suit stepped out, clipboard in hand, and began surveying the property. Curious and slightly concerned, Greg approached the man. "Can I help you?" The man turned, offering a polite but businesslike smile. "Mr. Gregory Thompson, I'm David Lawson from Evergreen Development. I'm here to do a final survey of the property." Greg's brow furrowed in confusion. "Survey? I'm sorry, but I think there must be some mistake. This property isn't for sale." David's smile faltered slightly. "Oh, I see. Well, according to our records, this lot, particularly the area where that shed stands, has been slated for redevelopment. We're planning to build a new apartment complex here." Greg felt as if the ground had dropped out from beneath him. "That's impossible. This is my property. I've lived here for years." "I understand your confusion, sir," David replied, his tone sympathetic but firm. "But the plans were approved months ago. Didn't you receive any notices?" Greg's mind raced. He vaguely remembered receiving some official-looking letters, but he'd been so wrapped up in his tech work back then that he'd simply set them aside, intending to deal with them later. A cold realization washed over him. His neglect might cost him everything they'd built. "There has to be some way to stop this," Greg said, his voice tight with emotion. David shrugged. "I'm just here to do the survey, Mr. Thompson. If you have concerns, you'll need to take them up with the city planning office. But I must warn you, at this stage, it's unlikely that anything can be done." As David continued his survey, Greg stood rooted to the spot, his mind reeling. How could he have let this happen? How could he explain this to Mia and Jake? Just then, he heard the excited voices of the children as they bounded out of the house, ready for the day's activities. They stopped short when they saw Greg's pale face. "Uncle Greg?" Mia asked, worry creeping into her voice. "What's wrong?" Greg took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Kids, we have a problem, a big one." Over the next hour, as workshop participants began to arrive, Greg explained the situation to Mia and Jake, and then to the gathered community members. The news spread quickly, and soon the backyard was filled with concerned neighbors, all eager to help. "We can't let them tear down the shed," one woman insisted. "It's become such an important part of our community." Jake tugged at Greg's sleeve, his eyes wide with worry. "What about the birds, Uncle Greg? Where will they go?" Greg felt a surge of determination. He looked around at the faces of his neighbors, at Mia and Jake, and at the beloved shed that had become so much more than just a building. "We're not giving up," he announced, his voice firm. "This shed, this yard, they're more than just property. They're a symbol of what we've built together. We're going to fight this." And fight they did. Greg quickly organized the community, leveraging their newfound connection to launch a campaign to save the shed and the surrounding green space. They used the Backyard Birds app to spread awareness, organized peaceful protests, and flooded the city planning office with calls and emails. Greg spent long nights researching zoning laws and environmental regulations, looking for any loophole that could help their cause. Mia and Jake threw themselves into the effort too, creating heartfelt posters and speaking passionately at community meetings about the importance of preserving urban green spaces. As the battle intensified, Greg found himself at the center of a movement that was gaining attention beyond their small neighborhood. Local news stations picked up the story, framing it as a David versus Goliath battle between a community-driven nature education initiative and big development. The pressure began to mount, and Greg felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He knew that the outcome of this fight would affect not just his family, but the entire community that had come to rely on their workshops and the green space they had cultivated. One evening, as Greg sat on the porch, exhausted from another day of campaigning, Mia and Jake joined him. They sat in silence for a while, watching the birds at the feeders they had built together. "Uncle Greg," Mia said finally, her voice small but determined. "We're not going to lose, are we?" Greg pulled them both close, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and determination. I don't know, kiddo, but I promise you this. We're going to give it everything we've got. As the sun set on another uncertain day, Greg looked out at the yard, at the shed that had started it all. He knew that the real battle was just beginning, but he also knew that they weren't fighting alone. They had a community behind them, united by a shared love for nature and the connections they had forged. Whatever came next, Greg was certain of one thing. The journey that had begun with a simple birdhouse had become something much bigger, something worth fighting for with everything they had. The battle to save the shed and the surrounding green space had consumed Greg's life for weeks. Each day brought new challenges, but also new allies. The community had rallied around their cause, transforming what had started as a simple nature education project into a full-fledged environmental movement. One morning, as Greg was poring over legal documents in search of a loophole that could help their case, his phone rang. The caller ID showed a name he hadn't seen in years: Michael Brennan. Greg's heart skipped a beat. Michael had been his best friend in college, but they'd drifted apart as their careers took them in different directions. Last he'd heard, Michael had become a successful real estate developer. With a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, Greg answered the call. "Michael, it's been a while." "Greg," Michael's voice came through, a hint of hesitation in his tone. "I saw you on the news. I'm the lead developer on the Evergreen project." Greg felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. His old friend was behind the very development, threatening everything they'd built. "Michael," Greg managed, his voice tight, "I had no idea." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Listen, Greg, I'm in town. I think we should talk. Face to face." An hour later, Greg found himself sitting across from Michael in a local coffee shop. The years had changed them both, but as they locked eyes, Greg could still see traces of the idealistic college student he once knew. "I had no idea it was your property, Greg," Michael began, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. "By the time I realized, things were already in motion." Greg leaned forward, his voice low and intense. "Michael, you have to understand, this isn't just about my property. We've built something special there. It's become the heart of our community." Michael nodded slowly. "I've seen the news reports, the protests. I have to admit, I'm impressed by what you've accomplished." "Then help us," Greg pleaded. "There must be some way to stop this development." Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not that simple, Greg. There are contracts, investors, plans that have been in place for months. I can't just call it off." Greg felt a surge of frustration. "Do you remember when we were in college? We used to talk about making a difference in the world. This is our chance, Michael. This project of ours, it's changing lives. It's connecting people with nature, with their community." As Greg spoke, he pulled out his phone and opened the Backyard Birds app. He showed Michael photos of their workshops, of children learning about local wildlife, of families working together to build birdhouses. "This is what you'd be destroying," Greg said softly. "Not just a shed, but a movement." Michael was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the images on Greg's phone. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "I had no idea it had become so important to people. But Greg, you have to understand my position. I have responsibilities, commitments." Greg nodded, an idea forming in his mind. "I understand, Michael. But what if we could find a way to make this work for everyone? What if, instead of destroying what we've built, you could be part of it? Make it even bigger?" Michael raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Greg leaned in, his eyes bright with excitement. "What if, instead of an apartment complex, we created a mixed-use development? One that incorporates green spaces, that makes nature education a central feature. We could expand our program, reach even more people." As Greg outlined his vision, He could see the spark of interest growing in Michael's eyes. It was the same look he'd seen countless times in college when they'd stayed up late, dreaming of ways to change the world. "It's an interesting idea," Michael admitted, "but it would require a complete overhaul of our plans. I'd have to convince the investors, rework the entire project." Greg nodded, understanding the challenge. "I know it's asking a lot, but think about the impact we could have. This could be a model for sustainable urban development, a way to bring nature back into our cities." Michael was quiet for a long moment, considering. Finally, he looked up at Greg, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You always were good at big ideas, Greg. I can't promise anything, but I'll see what I can do. Give me a week to talk to my team, to run some numbers." As they stood to leave, Michael reached out and clasped Greg's shoulder. "It's good to see you again, old friend. I'm glad life brought us back together, even if it's under these circumstances." Greg felt a surge of hope as he watched Michael walk away. He knew they still had a long road ahead, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like they had a real chance. As he made his way home, Greg's mind raced with possibilities. He couldn't wait to share this development with Mia and Jake, with the entire community that had rallied around their cause. Whatever came next, he knew that the journey that had begun with a simple birdhouse was far from over. In fact, it might be on the verge of its biggest chapter yet. The week that followed Greg's meeting with Michael was a whirlwind of activity. The community, energized by the possibility of a compromise, threw themselves into brainstorming sessions and planning meetings. Greg's backyard became a hub of creativity and collaboration, with neighbors of all ages contributing ideas for the potential new development. Mia and Jake were at the center of it all, their enthusiasm infectious. They had set up a large bulletin board in the shed, covered with colorful sticky notes full of suggestions from community members. "Uncle Greg, look!" Mia exclaimed one afternoon, pointing to the board. "Mrs. Rodriguez suggested we could have a butterfly garden, and Mr. Chen thinks we should have a community vegetable plot." Jake nodded excitedly. "And I think we should have a treehouse library, where people can read books about nature up in the trees." Greg couldn't help but smile at their excitement. "Those are all fantastic ideas, kids. But remember, we don't know for sure if Michael will be able to change the plans. We need to be prepared for any outcome." Despite his cautionary words, Greg found himself caught up in the wave of optimism. He spent long nights sketching out potential layouts, envisioning a space that could serve both the needs of the development and the community's desire for nature education. As the week drew to a close, tension mounted. The entire neighborhood seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for news from Michael. Greg tried to keep everyone's spirits up, but he couldn't shake the nervousness that had settled in the pit of his stomach. Finally, on a sunny Saturday morning, Michael's car pulled up in front of Greg's house. The neighborhood had gathered in Greg's backyard, a mix of anticipation and anxiety palpable in the air. Michael stepped out of his car, his expression unreadable. As he made his way to the backyard, the crowd parted silently to let him through. Greg met him halfway, his heart pounding. "Michael," Greg said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "We've been looking forward to hearing from you." Michael nodded, his eyes scanning the crowd. "I can see that. Greg, I've spent the week talking to my team, crunching numbers and negotiating with the investors." Greg held his breath, acutely aware of the dozens of eyes fixed on them. Michael paused, then a small smile broke across his face. "It wasn't easy, but we've managed to come up with a compromise." A collective gasp went through the crowd, followed by an excited murmur. Greg felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he knew they weren't out of the woods yet. "What kind of compromise?" he asked. Michael pulled out a rolled-up set of blueprints from under his arm. "We can't scrap the entire development plan, but we've managed to redesign it to incorporate a significant amount of green space and community areas." As Michael unrolled the blueprints on a nearby table, The crowd pressed closer. Greg's eyes widened as he took in the new design. The apartment complex was still there, but it had been reimagined. Green roofs, vertical gardens, and a large central park area dominated the plans. "We've allocated space for your nature education center," Michael explained, pointing to a section of the blueprint. "It'll be larger than your current shed, with state-of-the-art facilities. And here," he moved his finger to another area, "we've planned for community gardens, nature trails, and even an outdoor amphitheater for workshops and events." Greg felt a lump form in his throat. It wasn't everything they had hoped for, but it was far more than he had dared to expect. He looked up at Michael, gratitude shining in his eyes. "This is incredible, Michael. Thank you." Michael shook his head. "Don't thank me yet. There's a catch." The excitement in the air dampened slightly as everyone leaned in to hear the condition. "The investors are willing to go ahead with this plan, but they need assurance that it will be financially viable," Michael explained. "They want to see community buy-in. We need to raise a portion of the funds for the Nature Education Center and the community spaces ourselves." Greg's mind raced. They would need to raise a significant amount of money in a short time. It seemed like an impossible task. But before he could voice his concerns, Mia's voice piped up from the crowd. "We can do it, Uncle Greg. We can have a big fundraiser." Jake joined in, his voice filled with determination. "Yeah, we can sell birdhouses and do nature tours." Suddenly, the backyard was abuzz with ideas. Neighbors called out suggestions for bake sales, charity auctions, and sponsored nature walks. The energy of the crowd was electric, full of hope and determination. Greg looked around at the faces of his neighbors, at Mia and Jake's excited expressions, and then back at Michael. He took a deep breath and extended his hand. "We accept the challenge," he said firmly, shaking Michael's hand. As cheers erupted from the crowd, Greg felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. They had won a major battle, but the war wasn't over yet. They had a monumental task ahead of them, but looking at the united community around him, Greg knew that together, they could make it happen. The journey that had begun with a simple birdhouse had taken yet another unexpected turn. As Greg hugged Mia and Jake close, he realized that their adventure was far from over. In fact, it was about to enter its most challenging and exciting phase yet. The weeks that followed the announcement of the compromise were a whirlwind of activity. The entire community rallied around the fundraising effort with a fervor that surprised even Greg. What had started as a simple nature education project had evolved into a full-fledged movement, uniting people from all walks of life. Greg found himself at the center of it all, coordinating efforts and brainstorming ideas. The old shed, once a quiet refuge, was now a bustling command center for their campaign. Mia and Jake were his constant companions, their enthusiasm infectious, and their ideas often brilliantly simple. One evening, as Greg was poring over fundraising numbers, his phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number with an area code he didn't recognize. "Hello?" Greg answered, curiosity in his voice. "Is this Gregory Thompson?" A deep, authoritative voice asked. "Yes, this is he," Greg replied, straightening in his chair. "Mr. Thompson, my name is Dr. Eleanor Blackwood. I'm the head of the National Urban Conservation Initiative. We've been following your story with great interest." Greg's heart skipped a beat. The NUCI was a renowned organization known for its innovative approaches to urban ecology. "Dr. Blackwood, it's an honor. How can I help you?" "Actually, Mr. Thompson, I believe we might be able to help you," Dr. Blackwood replied. "Your project has caught our attention. The way you've mobilized your community and integrated technology with nature education is exactly the kind of initiative we look to support." Greg could hardly believe what he was hearing. "Support? In what way?" "We'd like to offer you a grant," Dr. Blackwood stated. It would cover a significant portion of your fundraising goal. But more than that, we want to use your project as a model for other communities across the country. Greg's mind raced with the possibilities. This could be the breakthrough they needed. But he knew he couldn't make this decision alone. "Dr. Blackwood, this is an incredible offer," he said, "but I need to discuss this with my team. Could I get back to you tomorrow?" "Of course," she replied. "I look forward to hearing from you." As soon as he hung up, Greg called an emergency meeting. Within an hour, the shed was packed with community members, all eager to hear the news. Greg explained the offer, watching as faces lit up with excitement. But he also voiced his concerns. This grant would be a game changer, he said. But it would also mean increased scrutiny and pressure. We'd be setting an example for the entire country. Are we ready for that? The room erupted in discussion. Some were thrilled at the prospect, while others worried about losing control of their grassroots movement. In the midst of the debate, Mia's voice cut through the noise. "Uncle Greg," she said, her young face serious. "Remember when we built that first birdhouse? We didn't know what we were doing then either, but we figured it out together." Jake nodded in agreement. "Yeah, and now look at everything we've done. We can do this too, can't we?" Greg felt a surge of pride and affection for his niece and nephew. They were right. Every step of this journey had been a leap into the unknown, and every time they had risen to the challenge. He looked around the room at the faces of his neighbors and friends. "Mia and Jake are right," he said. "This is a big step, but it's one we can take together. Who's with me?" The response was unanimous. Cheers and applause filled the shed as everyone voiced their support. The next morning, Greg called Dr. Blackwood to accept the offer. What followed was a flurry of activity as they prepared for the next phase of their project. As news of the grant spread, media attention intensified. Greg found himself giving interviews, explaining their vision for a new kind of urban development that prioritized nature and community. The fundraising effort, bolstered by the grant and the increased publicity, exceeded all expectations. Donations poured in from across the country, many accompanied by messages of support and stories of similar initiatives inspired by their project. On the day they finally reached their fundraising goal, the entire neighborhood gathered in Greg's backyard for a celebration. As Greg stood on the porch, looking out at the sea of smiling faces, he felt overwhelmed by how far they had come. Mia and Jake stood beside him, their faces beaming with pride. "We did it, Uncle Greg," Mia said, squeezing his hand. Greg nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "We sure did, kiddo. All of us together." As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the backyard, Greg raised his glass for a toast. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd, "and to the power of community." The cheer that went up was deafening. As Greg looked out at the faces of his neighbors, at the old shed that had started it all, and at the blueprints for their new development pinned to the bulletin board, he felt a profound sense of accomplishment and hope. The journey that had begun with a simple birdhouse had transformed not just their neighborhood, but potentially urban development across the country. As Greg hugged Mia and Jake close, he knew that while one chapter of their adventure was closing, another, even more exciting one, was just beginning. In that moment, watching a pair of chickadees flit to the birdhouse they had built so long ago, Greg realized that sometimes the smallest actions could lead to the biggest changes. All it took was a little curiosity, a lot of hard work, and a community willing to come together for a common cause. As the celebration continued around him, Greg smiled, knowing that whatever challenges the future held, they would face them together, just as they had from the very beginning.